I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for another discussion hosted by the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility. My name is Gerardo Espinal Franco. I'm the Assistant Director at the Stone Center. I'm very happy to introduce our inaugural book talk event, where the topic of family structure and its link to socioeconomic inequality will be discussed through the lens of a new book by Professor Melissa Kearney. Professor Kearney is a Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland, the Director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, and a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. She's a distinguished and data-driven scholar whose research has made significant contributions to our understanding of poverty, inequality, and social policies intended to remedy these challenges. Her new book, The Two-Parent Privilege, offers an analysis of the decline in marriage that may be linked with a variety of economic difficulties for parents and a host of impediments to upward mobility for children, reigniting a long debate in the U.S. about the consequences of broad changes in family structure and parenting since the 1970s. Joining Professor Kearney for our discussion this evening are several esteemed colleagues. Stephen Durlauf, Director of the Stone Center and Steen's Professor in Educational Policy. Damon Jones, Associate Director of the Stone Center and a professor here at Harris. Ariel Kalil, a Stone Center advisor, and Daniel Levin, Professor of Public Policy here at UChicago. Each brings a unique perspective and wealth of expertise to different dimensions of the topic at hand. A slight change to our agenda tonight. Following the remarks from our panelists, Wodtke, Associate Director of the Stone Center and Professor of Sociology, will moderate the discussion between the speakers and facilitate questions from the audience. Unfortunately, Leslie Turner will not be able to join us this evening. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our panelists and moderator for what we hope will be a thought-provoking discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks so much for having me and for organizing this. It's a treat to be here. And I also want to acknowledge that one of the first places I presented the work that I was doing, pulling together for this book, was at the Harris School. I presented this work before I submitted my manuscript in an academic seminar to Harris School faculty. And so I've really benefited from comments from people at this institution from the beginning of this project. So what I want to do with my time at the podium is to give some broad, a broad introduction to the themes and the data that I outline in the book. And I want to do that by starting with my motivation for writing this book, which is really an interest in inequality and social mobility in America. And I want to situate this topic of family structure, or what I refer to as the two-parent privilege, in this broader conversation. And so in my experience in the past 2+ decades as somebody studying inequality and poverty and family well-being and social mobility in America, I've been in, at this point, countless conversations with other social scientists and policymakers and about how to address the high level of inequality, threats to social mobility in the US. And I kept finding over and over that we would return to the same familiar topics. Things like how to improve the safety net, make it stronger for families. How do we improve schools? How should we advance affordable housing, engage in criminal justice reform? How should we develop stronger labor market institutions? How can we have progressive tax reform to pay for some of these initiatives and get more money to people who needed it? These were all topics that are really important. I've written on many of them myself, but I kept coming back to the fact that one of the most strongest factors driving inequality, family well-being, threatening social mobility in this country was what's been going on for the past 4 decades with families in America. And this was really obvious in the data, and most social scientists knew that family and family structure was important. But in my experience, this was typically the elephant in the room on these conversations. It's a lot harder to talk about the role of families and what to do about the increase in kids living in a one-parent home than it is to talk about how to make the tax code more progressive. And why? Well, obviously, when you bring up topics of families, it's a lot more personal. There's a lot of sensitivities involved. It's also harder to know as social scientists or policy wonks what to do about it. But I just got to the point where I felt like we really couldn't have an honest or productive conversation about inequality or social mobility in America. We won't really make great headway addressing these things if we don't deal with the need to strengthen families in this country. So that's what the book's about. Let me start with just a basic motivating fact, which is that over the past 40 years, the share of kids in the US living with married parents has declined from 77% to 63%. That's a pretty stunning decline. Only 63% of kids in America now, at a snapshot in time, according to US Census data, live with married parents. We'd feel very differently about this statistic if 37% of kids were just living with stable, cohabiting parents who were essentially committed to the partnership of raising their kids, but just weren't married in name. But in fact, that's not what's happened. Rather, 21% of kids now live with an unpartnered mother. That means a mother who has neither a spouse nor a second partner of either gender in the home that they consider a partner. Another, about 4.5% of kids live with an unpartnered father, using that same definition. Another 4.5% of kids live with neither parent. And 8% of kids in the US Census live with unmarried parents. What that means is one biological parent and the parent's partner. And in about 25% to 40% of cases, that partner is not the child's second biological parent. So even that 8% of kids living with unmarried parents sort of overstates the share of kids growing up with the benefit of their two parents in the home. This puts US kids in a unique position. According to this Pew Research survey of 130 countries around the globe, US kids are more likely than kids in any other country in the world to live with only one parent in their home. So this is, some countries in Europe or the UK are starting to catch up to the US, but still the US is an outlier here. And my take on this is US exceptionalism that doesn't serve our kids or families well. Now, one might look at this and say, well, American women are the richest women in the world. They're the most likely to be able to financially provide for their kids on their own or to not need a partner to undertake the project of raising kids or running a household. But this is where the class gap is really critical to all of this. And so make no mistake about it, it is not the most economically successful women in America who in large numbers find themselves raising children in a home without a partner. Here I'm showing you what's happened over the past 40 years in the share of kids living with married parents by mom's education. So among the kids whose moms have a 4-year college degree, the share of them living with married parents has fallen only from 90% to 84% in 40 years. That's a pretty small decline, and it's actually quite surprisingly small when you think about how much bigger that group of women is. So it used to be only 11% of moms had a 4-year college degree. Now it's about 30%, and yet still marriage among college-educated moms is holding strong. The really, I think, surprising fact here is what's happened in the middle of the education distribution. So over the past 40 years, the share of kids living with married parent among those whose moms have a high school degree, maybe some college, but not a 4-year college degree, there you see this 23 percentage point decrease. Such that now the share of kids living with married parents among moms who have a high school degree is roughly equivalent to those whose moms don't even have a high school degree. So this middle group has sort of converged down. We used to think about in the 80s single motherhood really being tightly associated with teen childbearing, poverty, the most disadvantaged groups in society. But when you look at the data now, what you see is really single motherhood, 5% of kids do live with a single dad, so I don't want to ignore that group, but this is really driven by moms. That's become much more common outside the college-educated class, even among these groups that we might have thought of as middle class. Okay, Just to be clear, cohabitation, again, is not closing these class gaps. What I'm showing you here is that now 12% of children whose moms have a four-year college degree live with an unpartnered mother, as compared to about 30% of everyone else. So we really want to think about what's happened here is that women who are less economically successful than college-educated women are the ones, again, finding themselves doing the really difficult work of raising a child in an unpartnered household setting. Okay, there are also differences across the major race and ethnic groups in the US. The emergence of a black-white gap in family structure in the 60s and 70s is well documented and has been studied at length. What's happened over the past 40 years is this emergence of the education gap that I've already emphasized, and so that compounds these issues. And so the issue of single parenthood or a lack of the two-parent privilege, and I'll come back to explaining more why I use that term, there's really a large, race, ethnic, cross-education differences here. So here what I'm showing you is by the four major race and ethnic groups that I identify in the US Census, by the three maternal education groups, you can see these differences. So for instance, if we look at Asian American families, they're an exception to this pattern in the sense that we have not seen an emergence of an education gradient among Asian American families in the US, which is quite striking, I think. So you see that among all three groups, education groups, children whose mothers identify as ethnically Asian in the census have very high rates of two-parent households. Among children whose mothers identify as Black in the census, those whose moms have a four-year college degree are twice as likely to be living with married parents as those who don't. Okay? And so keeping in mind these race, ethnic, cross-education differences is really important. Finally, what I want to point out just in terms of trends is that in a very mechanical way, this divergence in family structure by education has amplified household income inequality that differences in the labor market would have delivered without this additional change. All right, so what am I showing here? In the top panel, I'm showing you in the top panel here, let's look at household income among the three different groups of moms if there's two parents in the household. So this is something that labor economists would typically do. Let's just, eliminate differences in the number of potential earners in a household. And what do we see? We see that among households headed by a four-year college graduate, or I should say, with a mom with a four-year college degree, household income went up by 59%, as compared to 8% for the middle group and a decrease of 14% for the bottom group. This is the well-known rise in inequality that's been documented over and over again in labor economics, right? College educated did really well, the middle group sort of roughly, stagnant, and a decrease at the bottom. Now what I'm showing you in the middle panel is what happened to household income for households headed by unpartnered mothers. First, if you just notice the shift left of the graph, what you're seeing, again, not surprisingly, is that household income among unpartnered mothered households for every level of income is about half that for the same education level with two parents. Why? Because two parents, are typically two earners and they tend to have twice as much income at a household level. But let's see, college-educated unpartnered mothers' earnings went up by about 60%. High school educated by 19%, the bottom group 24%. All unpartnered mothers, all groups of unpartnered mothers are doing better now than they were 40 years ago. The bottom panel puts these two things together, allows family structure and earnings to move as they actually did in the real world. And now what do we see? Households headed by college-educated workers, their earnings went up by 55%. Why? Because college-educated workers did really well and they continued to get married and have two adults in the household. The middle group now, instead of an 8% or 19% increase in household earnings, their household earnings dropped by 4%. Why? Because they're 23 percentage points more likely to only have one adult in the household. And so in a very mechanical sense, the rise in one-parent households for that middle-educated group has eroded middle-class economic security. And then you can see by a comparison of the top and the middle and the top and the bottom, it's amplified earnings inequality. Okay, what's driving these trends? I spend a lot of time in the book talking about them. Let me just establish a few facts. This is really being driven by an increase in the share of kids whose parents are never married. Divorce is down in the US. It's down conditional on marriage. Why? Fewer people are getting married. They're getting married later. But an increasing share of mothers have never been married. This matters just in understanding what's driving these trends, but it also matters for the experience of kids, because kids whose parents were at some point married and later divorced, for much of their childhood or for some of their childhood, had the benefit of two parents in the household. They're also much more likely to subsequently receive child support or have engagement with the second parent. So even thinking about the status of unpartnered mothers shifting from divorced to never married actually matters, has consequences for what that means in a resource sense for the mom and the child. Okay. We've also, so it's not driven by divorce, it's driven by an increase in never married. Why? There's been a very large share, an increase in the share of births that are non-marital. And again, here I'm showing you that there's an education divergence here. So overall, the share of births that are now to unmarried mothers over 40 years increased from 18% to 40%. For high school educated moms, this doubled from 25% to 52%. More than half of births in the US to moms who have a high school degree are now non-marital births. This corresponds to really the reduction in marriage outside college-educated adults overall. So here's my broad sweep of social history in terms of what's happened to marriage. Now I go back to the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, we had the social cultural revolution, changing in expectations about marriage and gender norms. We see a reduction in marriage for all three education groups. And then in the 80s and 90s, what happened? The percent of women being married for college-educated women actually stalled out. So college-educated women now are much more likely to be married than other women. And you see again for high school-educated women and men, just a straight line down. Okay, so this is really driven by a reduction in marriage, and more to the point, a separation of the institution of marriage from having and raising kids among adults without a four-year college degree. Okay, why? Again, very broad strokes. In the book, I go into all of this in great detail and cite studies making the case. We had, the way I tell the story, or the way I read the story from the data and the evidence, there were broad social changes. Then we went into the 80s and 90s. A whole bunch of economic shocks hit high-income countries, including the US. Those shocks were generally very good for college-educated workers, not so good for workers without a college degree, especially men. I'm thinking about the loss of manufacturing jobs, the loss of industrial jobs on account of increased import competition from China, the adoption of industrial robots. We have causal evidence that in communities hit by those shocks, where there was a loss of these well-paying middle-class jobs for men, there was a reduction in marriage and a corresponding rise in the share of kids living in single-mother homes. That compounds with new social norms and establishes new social conventions, such that now there's a decoupling of childbearing and marriage in many communities, in many populations, such that even when we see in communities now where there have been positive shocks, jobs have returned, earnings have increased for non-college educated men. What do we see? We see that births go up, but marriages don't, and non-marital birth rates fall. And in some of my research, I've compared that to what happened from similar shocks in the 70s and 80s, and you get a different effect. So my read of this is that we've had sort of a compounding of changing social conventions with economic shocks that disadvantaged non-college educated men that led to this separation, and now we're in a new social paradigm. It will be very hard to turn things around. Okay, why does this all matter for kids? Really quickly, what's my time? Okay, okay. He said plenty of time. I could go all night. You're gonna have to be more specific. Okay. All right. 7 minutes. Perfect. So I take a resource perspective approach to all of this. I very much approach this topic as an economist. And so, the very basic fact here is that household resources are greater in homes where there's 2 parents as opposed to 1. And that's part of the privilege. So this isn't a value-laden statement. This doesn't take anything away from the millions of single parents who are working tirelessly to do everything they can to provide for their kids. It's just a simple statement of reality that raising kids is really hard. When there are 2 adults in the household, there are more combined resources, and that is an advantageous situation for children. So the first obvious resource advantage is income. We know just in a cross-section, children being raised in single mother homes are 5 times more likely to live in poverty as compared to married parent homes. Single father homes, they're 3 times more likely to live in poverty. Median household income is twice as high, basically across the education distribution, if there's married parents versus 1 parent. Income is very protective, especially in the US. It's the difference between what kind of neighborhood schools kids can live in, what schools they go to, all sorts of things. We have tons of evidence that income matters for kids' outcomes. But it's not just income. Households with 2 parents also have more collective parental time to invest in their children, and there's more emotional energy. And so I review some of the data on this. Ariel, Kalil, of course, has produced seminal work in this field. Generally, the way to think about this is more resources lead to more parental inputs. We see that higher resourced homes spend much more on kids. This is another way that the college-educated class is pulling away from everyone else and basically just showering their kids with tons of resources, spending on directed education, enrichment activities, all these things that set them up on a better path to be successful in various dimensions in life. We also see that married parents, in particular higher educated married parents, both separately, both married moms spend more time with their kids than unmarried moms, and married dads spend more time with their kids than unmarried dads. Put them together, those kids are getting a lot more time of parents reading to them, driving to them their activities, talking to them, all things that we think are beneficial for their outcomes. Okay, we have lots of evidence that this translates into better outcomes for children. We do not, nor will we ever, nor should we ever, have a randomized control trial that randomly assigns some kids to live with married parents and others not to. And so it's really hard to break that, but the preponderance of evidence suggests that kids growing up with the benefit of 2 parents in the household have all these additional resources. And what do we see? We see they're less likely to get in trouble in school, they're more likely to graduate high school, they're more likely to graduate college, then they go on to have higher levels of earnings, and they're more likely to be married themselves as adults. Controlling for things like income and time spent helps us understand the mechanisms through which these 2 parents confer these privileges to their kids. And basically the findings are what you would expect. Once you adjust for income differences in households, the gaps in kids' outcomes are smaller. Now that's all fine and well in our regression, but let's be clear, in the real world we don't equalize income between single and married parent households. That's one of the biggest differences, right? We also see that if kids living with only a mom are spending more time with their dads, that seems to lessen the likelihood that they have behavioral trouble or get in trouble in school, okay? So all of those things help us understand the mechanisms. Of course, the context and situation matters. Again, here I'm giving you a very simple sweep of this, but I'm drawing on academic work. The idea here is what a mother brings herself to the household, plus what her partner would bring, plus how those resources translate into kids' outcomes really determine what my colleague and I refer to as the marriage premium for kids. And this is really important to think about because as single mothers have become less disadvantaged over time, they bring more themselves. So they're more likely to be able to keep their child out of poverty. Thinking about whether marriage would benefit an individual child or a household depends on what that second parent would bring. We have evidence from economic literature showing that, for instance, when the second parent is a convicted criminal, actually random assignment to judges that are more likely to put that parent in prison looks like it's beneficial for kids. And this is, I think, a sad finding, but it really underscores the point that thinking about what the partner would bring and how we shore up, sort of the economic position, social position, the ability and preparedness for millions of dads to be positive contributors to the household really is at the heart of what we need to do. Okay, I'm just going to show you this one figure to make the point that we're not just talking about keeping kids out of poverty anymore. I want to shift this conversation to think more broadly about class gaps. What I'm showing you here is the likelihood that a child graduates college by age 25 by the mom's education level and whether she's married or not. And this helps underscore the point that it matters what she brings herself and what her partners bring. Because at the very left side, only 5% of kids whose moms are unmarried and don't have a high school degree graduate from college. Among married moms who don't have a high school degree, it only increases to 7%. As you move up the education distribution, we see really big increases. So even unmarried moms with a college degree, 29% of their kids graduate college, as compared to 57% of kids who have married parents and the mom has a college degree. When I control for income, that gap only shrinks to 20%. Again, doing things like getting through college requires really a lot of resources and a lot of investment in kids. And it's not until you have highly educated married parents that a majority of kids achieve that high success marker. Okay, I'll skip the additional considerations. Hopefully we'll come to these in some of our discussion later on. I'm going to conclude by, in rapid fire 30 seconds, what I take away from this, but I hope, we get a chance to talk about this. What do I think can and should be done? And let me just say, the most controversial position I take in this book is that I think we need to be honest about the benefits and advantages of a two-parent home and foster a norm of two-parent homes for children. I do not think we should accept a reality where the two-parent family is becoming increasingly a thing of the past for adults without a college degree. Okay, that is just, in my mind, very defeatist and resigns us to large class and income gaps. I don't think we should just run successful marriage programs. I do think we should put a lot more funding and research energy into figuring out how to strengthen families and meeting them where they are. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Melissa, for coming. It's an important book. It's a controversial book, and it's important to think about the issues here. Obviously, they're of fundamental policy importance, and for anybody who's an egalitarian or concerned about inequality, these issues, the questions you raise, have to be part of the conversation. So what I want to do in my discussion is I want to make 3 points. One will be a point of agreement, one will be a point of partial agreement, and one will be a disagreement. And in doing so, I want to basically, as I say, 3 things. The first is, you are surely correct that family structure matters. One of the things I have found bizarre in the public reaction to the book, at least in social media and some book reviews, is questioning this fact. I think any vision we have of the developmental trajectories of children, there are trajectories in which family income every year matters, in which family structure every year matters, in which neighborhoods matter, schools matter, et cetera. And it's really impossible from the perspective either of the conventional social science, not economics, but social science theories of development, as well as the facts that are on the table about how different trajectories have influences on children, to disagree with the proposition that changes in family structure are going to have some consequence for the eventual outcomes that children have in adulthood. And so I think you need to be applauded for the fact that you're willing to put these facts on the table in an unabashed and unapologetic fashion. Now, where I want to say I have a partial agreement has to do with the policy recommendations. So again, fact number one I want on the table is I think the basic claims, empirical claims about the role of families, the empirical literatures on this are really overwhelming, and they try to address issues such as the usual suspects on causality, mechanisms, et cetera. And so I don't think that that's a place that one wants to think about disagreements. Where I have a partial agreement, but a partial disagreement, has to do with the policy remedies. The first thing I would say that is, by and large, I endorse every policy recommendation you meant in terms in one dimension, and that is one way to think about, here's a fact, which is there's been a coevolution of family structure, incomes in a society, and we think there have been consequences for the distribution of income, consequences for intergenerational mobility, is to ask where are the levers for policy. The dimension where I would fully agree with you are policies whose objective is to diminish the effects of disparities in family backgrounds on future outcomes. And so what I mean by that is that one way to make the argument is that what Melissa has identified in the book are these trajectories of family resources broadly defined, which are diverging in certain important respects, and as a result are causing divergence in the outcomes of children in the next generation. The obvious policy, an obvious policy answer to that would be to ask, how do we render the accident of birth, the accident of family structure, the accident of family income less important in terms of those disparities? And so when a recommendation is made in the book, such as the enhancement of early childhood investments, education, I certainly think that that's a very appropriate argument. What I would emphasize is that in doing this has really nothing to do with family structure. It has to do with equality of opportunity considerations. In other words, that in thinking about the injustice of inequality, a natural dimension, which is due, of course, to John Romer and others, is to focus on responsibility-sensitive egalitarianism. And it's a triviality to say children are not responsible for the accidents of birth or the accidents of family structure. And so in that sense, I think the justifications for many of the policies that Melissa advocates, they aren't really coupled to the issue of family structure. They're coupled to the consequences of having disparities in resources, et cetera. And so I think that that's an important thing that I would emphasize. The second thing I would do, and this is what I call the partial disagreement, is I think that there needs to be more attention on disparities in adolescence. In other words, it has become commonplace to advocate early childhood investment, and I think for good reasons. It's an important thing, and there's obviously powerful evidence about its efficacy. However, I think it is important also to step back and think about this issue of trajectories. In other words, that children have experiences, family structure, income, the occupations of the parents, the educational levels of the parents, all of this which are influencing them at different ages. And for that reason, I think that, again, in general, it's not specific to the book, I think that the public discourse on inequality and intergenerational mobility has neglected the adolescent years. And so I will give you an example of why I get to make this claim as an empirical proposition. So this is recent research I've conducted with Yu-Soon Chang, Seung-Hee Lee, and Jun Park. So what we do is we take a standard data set in the United States and ask the following question. Can I identify sensitivities to adult permanent income, average income in adulthood, with reference to sensitivities of income at different ages? And so without going into the particular statistical procedures that one uses to do that, it turns out the right way to think about the income trajectory affecting kids is there is a permanent income component, that's the usual suspect, but there's something else going on. And remarkably, what shows up in the American data is this increasing sensitivity of child outcomes to parental income all through adolescence. It drops at age 18, and you can guess why. That's an American social norm in terms of the obligations of parents to children. My point is the following, and that is that, again, I'll stipulate that we've got every robustness check imaginable, so I'm confident this is in the data. The question is, what does it mean? An interpretation I would put on the table that I think is important is the following, and that is in thinking about the consequences of family resources for children, you have to ask, what are the resources going to? And what does the social safety net in America represent at different ages? And I think whatever view one takes of that safety net, it is better for young children than it is for teenagers. More generally, in thinking about the resource allocations, what is happening as children get older is that the primary object that family resources are controlling are memberships in schools and neighborhoods. In other words, the reason that income is turning out to be important in the adolescent years is because it's telling us something about what the parent's income does for the children, but it's not a member of the direct investment in the children in the early childhood investment sense. It is that as children develop, and as is known separately from Jeff's work and others, as social influences become more important as opposed to direct family influences, the inequalities are emerging because of the disparities in the capacity of parents to locate their children in particular neighborhoods, in particular schools. So all of that speaks to me to a different set of policies that I would recommend to ameliorate, to diminish the importance of the disparities because of the accident of birth. I put this in the broad category of what I'm going to call the memberships theory of inequality. In other words, that what is driving inequalities are the memberships that people experience. Early childhood focuses directly on the family in isolation. In other words, what the parents are doing in the context of the home or not. As children develop and the social influences become more important, other memberships matter. Peers, neighborhoods, schools, et cetera. And so those are the disparities that I think are particularly salient, at least in the data analyses that are suggested by using more powerful statistical techniques. And as a result, that to me is a recommendation of thinking about the amelioration question differently. And if I was to summarize the upshot of that, integration. In other words, it is the segregation of neighborhoods, the segregation of schools by ethnicity, by gender, by race, by income, and of course, in addition to race. That is the manifestation of the differences in the family backgrounds, and that's where I think there needs to be more policy attention. So the final thing I want to say is this is where I said we have some disagreement, and that has to do with how to think about this issue of improving norms. Let me say, first of all, that I think that it is correct that one cannot use conventional economic explanations to understand the trends in family structure. And I want to augment Melissa's work with a couple of additional things. One of them is to actually look at the incarceration rates by race in the United States, and this is a paper that was literally just appeared in Demography, which demonstrated a remarkable decline of incarceration rates among African Americans. And so, you know, this famous statistic that 1/3 of African American men will eventually be in prison at some point in their life, that's now down to 20%. That is a dramatic change. We don't see associated changes in marital structure associated with it. We suggest that the conventional explanation about marriageable men is not a sufficient one. The second thing I would say, and this is a recent paper by Andrew Cherlin, who's your neighbor down the road, is a demonstration that if you look at changes in non-marital for single motherhood, there are dramatic changes among college graduates. So in other words, if you were asking questions about kind of what's happened in very recent times, something that's underappreciated is the extent to which women that are college graduates are unmarried at the time of their first child. So I put those two on the table as I think is reinforcement of the importance of social factors. Now, of course, Melissa mentioned this, in thinking all of these through, you have to be very careful about dynamics. There's a bunch of nonlinearities going on, and I think there's a partial irreversibility. In other words, whatever happens in society, if you change behaviors, social attitudes change, and it's not a matter that you can necessarily move back. And that's really your evidence on the fracking, for example. When you found the reversal of the economics, it didn't have the effect that would be predicted by the standard model. However, and this is the point of disagreement, I'm not sure I want to focus on norms as a thing to strengthen. And so first of all, think about the following thought experiment. Suppose that there were, and I know you don't emphasize divorce, but there's a thought experiment. Suppose that there are cases where somebody is an unkind husband, but an excellent father. It's good for the children that the parents do not get divorced. Listen, I completely agree. We never tell those people not to get divorced. And this is the point I want to put on the table. And that is that in thinking about norms and an argument in favor of norms, I think you have to make a judgment as to what is unsatisfactory about the norms. It has to be a statement that we believe that there's something about the decisions that mothers and fathers are making that does not fulfill some prior moral commitments that we think ought to be made. And in my judgment, it is extraordinarily hard to make that argument in this context. Now, why do I say that? And it's for the following reason. The obvious argument in favor of a strengthening of social norms is spillover effects, externalities, the notion that parents are not internalizing the effects of their choices on the children. But I think of all the cases where we think about externalities, all the cases we think about spillover effects, this may be the least persuasive. I'm not a great admirer of sociobiology in general, but I think the evidence on universality of care about children, that it really is a universal construct. Marriage is essentially a human universal. In other words, there's literally only one society on the planet that's been identified, which is a contemporary exception to the existence of marriage. Furthermore, it turns out that romantic love, outside claims that historically people only wanted to get married to reproduce children, that's false. In other words, much of the work in anthropology has suggested a possible universal. And of course, there's no evidence that, that people are less interested in having committed two-partnered families. And so all that suggests to me something different, and that is, I think a better way to think about things, or at least I would put it as an observation, is that it's not clear to me we want to say the norms are worse now than they were before. You have to have an explanation. If norms change, then perhaps it's merely a statement that patriarchal attitudes, etc., self-realization as a value for women improved across time. And so I don't want to say norms because I think norms by definition have a moral content to it, which I am unprepared to say is an issue here. And so all of that is to say that I agree with to wrap up, I know I'm supposed to have wrapped up a minute ago, and I have some quotations that you could look at in the slides. Basically what I do is I quote James Coleman, who famously said that social norms actually are a form of unfreedom. In other words, a statement that my choices are constrained by others than myself. John Stuart Mill, of course, had many things to say about the cases where social norms can be inhibiting in behavior. So those are the kind of the nasty quotations I'm going to put on the table. Obviously, she doesn't think any of that. What I am saying seriously is that I think we have to be extremely careful in talking about strengthening norms because there's an implicit moral judgment in that statement. And I don't think that there's a case that can be made to that. And so for me, the policy recommendations is the amelioration of unjust inequalities through the accident of birth. And that's where we have full agreement on the next step. So thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome again. This is we're on a roll, Stone Center. We get a packed house. We have a lively debate. So thanks for everyone for joining us again. I'm gonna. How much time? 10. Okay. All right. So I need to have a timer for myself just so I can make sure that I don't run over time. Okay. So. So let me just say, this is a great topic of discussion for the Stone Center. We're interested in inequality. And we know what happens during their childhood for people matters a lot for their lifetime outcomes and inequality. And then at a policy school, this is also a very relevant topic, in part because there's an important question about what to do in this case because children are not selecting the family that they're born into or the situation that they're born into, and these things are very consequential for them. So very excited to have this discussion here. First thing I want to talk about, in reading the book, there was a good collation of empirical results from Melissa's research, from other people's research that I found very interesting. I think something that a lot of people, have an intuition for that was really highlighted in the book is how these economic trends have affected marital structure and these outcomes, and child well-being. And so there's some very clean evidence there when you look at different communities that have been hit hard by different economic trends, what then happens to the family structure. And so that's pointed to as a very robust body of evidence. Another interesting thing is the asymmetry here when those things start to improve again. So that was very interesting as well. I'll come back to that, but in the book, there's discussion of when there was a fracking boom in certain communities, you had a reemergence of good jobs, in particular for men. And then what the researchers found was an increase in births, number of births, but not necessarily an increase in marriage or births within a marriage. And so while both of those things sort of retreated during poor economic times, during the rebound, they both didn't equally rebound, which is interesting, and as I said, I'll come back to. Another interesting discussion that I appreciated was the discussion of welfare reform and so-called welfare programs, and what role did those play in family structure. And actually, the evidence that's discussed in the book points to a weak or not a fully, that these trends do not explain most of the variation that we're seeing over time. So that these welfare programs don't seem to be the key thing driving this change in family structure. And in a lot of debates you hear that this brought up, so it's good to discuss the evidence there. So the next set of things that are at the core of this book, there's the question of the effect of family structure on inequality and income inequality and resources for children. And so here I'm going to be a little more skeptical than Stephen, just because, you guys are students, you take a lot of our econometrics class, we're always going to be a little skeptical. But here we want to ask a causal question, and I'm not actually questioning the causal evidence that we do have. I'm going to actually, in some sense, grapple with the question itself. So when we think about a causal channel or a causal mechanism, we're usually led to think about, okay, let's hold everything fixed and let's flip a switch and let's just change one thing in your life and see how that affects everything else, and we can isolate a clean causal impact. And with cash or economic conditions, those things are a little easier to think about. What would be the ideal experiment? Let's just give people more cash and see what happens. Do they change their behavior? In terms of family structure, it's a little harder for me to think about what even is the ideal experiment. Not to say that we would run one, but what is the ideal experiment? And the challenge is that your family structure, your income, other things like your race, and then child outcomes, those are all moving together over time slowly. There are these trends in all of these things over time, and there are different causes of changes in family structure. So to me, it's not completely clear that I want to hold everything fixed and just change your family structure. There are things that caused your family structure to change, and those may matter in terms of how a change in family structure will result in downstream outcomes for children. If there's a slow change in social norms over time, is the ideal experiment to undo those social norms and then see what happens. If it's just about a declining economy for certain types of men, is the ideal experiment to change those economic outcomes and then see what happens both for family structure and child outcomes. Some of the evidence that we do have in terms of looking at different family structures and outcomes, they face a difficulty in, I think, even identifying what is the ideal magic wand that we would have. One example to sort of illustrate this is there is some evidence in the book, okay, we need something that causes family structure to change somewhat randomly. One of the studies looks at the gender of the firstborn child. And when it's a daughter, I believe that there's a higher likelihood of divorce. That's just in the data. Whether your firstborn child is a daughter or son in the U.S. is largely out of your control for a lot of reasons. And so let's compare if your firstborn child is a son or a daughter. We know you might be more likely to get divorced. In the latter case, what happens to the child outcomes? And so there, this is a case where we have some variation in family structure, but if it's due to the gender of the daughter, then it's just hard to disentangle that from why would the gender of your daughter cause a divorce to happen, and what else does the gender of your daughter affect in terms of your child's ultimate outcomes. And so, I think that there's some difficulties there, and also just thinking about like the causal effect of family structure because it's so intertwined with other things. The other thing I want to say is that there's evidence that we showed that we compared people who have a high school education or less than a college education. We looked at those who were married and those who weren't. And we looked at the resources available to the child. And, you know, there, a really difficult question is to know, for the unmarried parents who have less than a college education, the ones who aren't married, if they were married, would they look like their married counterparts? Would their income double? So, you know, you can think maybe there's a fixed pool of eligible partners. The ones who are married have found the partners that will double your income, and the ones who aren't married, there's none left that can double your income. So what would happen if those people get married? That's a complicated question to answer. And so I think that that's a challenge we face empirically. So the causal effect of family structure on child outcomes, you know, it's still, I think, a difficult thing to tease out. And there, I think you can say maybe directionally this is going to be an improvement on average, but I think you also want to know, is this an improvement for every family? Or are some families better off without the marriage, and some families are better off with the marriage? You know, there could be different types of families. And so that's an interesting question, I think. The next thing that I do want to talk about, a couple of things about some of the empirical evidence. So these are just questions for clarification. So in the kind of key graph at the beginning of the paper is that among all children, 77% were in married households, and it went down to 63%. And so, but the ones who were with single mothers, it went from 17% up to 21%. So there wasn't as much of a growth in single mother households as there was a decline in married households. So my question there is just, where are most of the kids transitioning to? The focus of the book is that there are a lot of single mother households, but that trend isn't as pronounced. So where are these kids transitioning to that are no longer married households? Are they transitioning to cohabitating households? That's a question I had. I couldn't completely tell from that graph. The second thing is, a lot of the statistics in the book are, among college-educated mothers, the rate of unmarried parents, when their child is born, has decreased by a small amount. And those, I think, are very interesting. I think another question, though, is to ask, among all children, where are the children of unmarried parents increasingly being found? And that you can't answer with the same statistics. The problem is that more and more children are being born into educated households. So, those two things go in the opposite direction. So, I don't know, wasn't able to do these calculations, but I tried to look it up, and if you look, there's a Pew study that says among infants, mothers of infants, a majority of them are, a majority of the kids who are in unmarried homes are in parents who have some college or more college. And so there, I think that's another question. Okay, it's time for me to wrap up. So the last thing I will say is that I do share concern with Steve about the normative conclusions of the book. And so there I would just say there has been a change in terms of norms about whether people want to be married or not. There are other norms that we could equally think about changing or not changing, norms about cohabitation, norms about gender roles. And so, the question I have there is, why just the norm of marriage? Why don't we focus on other norms that, could equally be easy or difficult to change, and what would be the impacts of those changes? But overall, I enjoy reading the book. Happy for the discussion. Looking forward to our continued discussion in the comments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, Melissa. Melissa's a longtime friend of mine, and I'm a big admirer of her work, and I especially appreciate her generous characterization of some of my work in her terrific book, and I'm happy to provide a few comments. So I'm going to build on a couple of things that I think both Stephen and Damon alluded to, which is really taking off from a fact that I think we all agree on, which is that at a descriptive level, children who grow up outside of a stable two-parent married household have worse outcomes on lots and lots of measures that we find in the data. But I think the big question before us is, what shall we do about that? And I am also going to reference some Pew data, which has been a big theme of the evening, and also Melissa's book. And I'd like to talk about a household arrangement that I've actually been studying for my entire academic career, and that is multi-generational households, which are, by definition, typically I'm thinking of 3 generations living together, grandparents and a parent generation and the children of those parents. I'm a big booster of this family arrangement, and I must say, in the 25 years I've been studying family structure, I am perpetually puzzled about why a promotion, a social norm if you want to call it, a policy incentive, a set of public conversations about multi-generational households is not more common. And the reason I'm puzzled by this is because I think if we just look again descriptively at the data, this household arrangement offers many of the attributes that we've been talking about in reading Melissa's book and that we've been talking about this evening. So again, just at a descriptive level, and I'm not going to talk at all about causality here for the same reasons that Damon cautioned us that that's a challenging thing to do. But at a descriptive level, multi-generational households are more common among the very populations that we're talking about tonight, those who are the least likely to be married. That the things that drive the formation of multi-generational households include both financial considerations and caregiving needs. That, again, at a descriptive level, living in this family formation seems to reduce poverty. That it is, almost by definition, a site for caregiving, and I would just add it's kind of a twofer because you can get caregiving in both directions across the generations. And that I think even more importantly, if we just look at survey data, again from Pew, for those who choose this arrangement, it is mostly reported to be a positive experience. And of course, that's a little bit of a self-evident, because if you hated it, you would probably have moved out a long time ago. But for those who do choose it and who are in such an arrangement at the time that the survey is being administered, it's reported in quite positive terms. So I'm going to go all the way back to one of the very first papers that I published as an assistant professor with my economist colleague, Tom DeLear, to show you, again, this was a descriptive project with a nationally representative survey, the NELS. And the title of our paper was Good Things Come in Threes, so I'm not burying the lead here, and you can probably guess what we found. And I'm sorry, these numbers are probably way too small for those in the back. But what I'm going to show you in the first column are just a variety of outcomes in adolescence, which Stephen encouraged us to look at. The kind of usual suspects outcomes that most demographers care about. Kids' academic achievement and their problem behavior and their sexual activity. And I'm going to show you, if we look in the second column, what the rates of those outcomes are for children who, at the moment we find them in a cross-section, are living with their 2 biological parents who have been married for that child's entire childhood. And those numbers in that column win as far as the numbers that you want to see. Those children have the best outcomes. But I want you to now look to the right, and where I've highlighted in red, I'm going to show you those same outcomes for children who, at the time of the survey, are living with their single mother who has never been married in a multi-generational household, and to the right, a comparable sample of children who is living with their mother who has formerly been married and who is also living with their grandparent. And what I want to show you in those numbers is that, again, descriptively, those children have just as good outcomes on almost all dimensions as their counterparts who are living with their 2 always married parents. Now, this is really getting to what Damon just told you. Should I think that, well, first of all, it's very small sample sizes. That's a problem. This is not, this was data that are more than 25 years old. Multi-generational households have grown dramatically in prevalence since the time I was able to look at these data. But who is in that group of multi-generational households? Who are those mothers and who are their children? When we look at who that sample is, those are very young mothers. I told you they were never married. They have very limited education, and they are very poor. Those are the young women who are living with their own parents. The way you want to think about this thought experiment is what would happen if I substituted the potential marriage partner that that young woman would choose? And does that potential hypothetical marriage partner add to these child outcomes more than what that young woman's own mother does? And the answer is no. For that young woman who fits that demographic profile, her own mother is just as good a second caregiver as is the prospective man that she would be married to. So this is not apples and oranges. This is really trying to think about who's the right counterfactual, and that is what Damon just told you to do. The last bit of data I'm going to show you on is something I worked on more recently with some time diary data. Here we used another nationally representative data set, the panel study of income dynamics. Here we looked at time investments in children, an important theme that Melissa describes at length in her book and a theme with which I totally agree. But what I want you to imagine here is it's not just the expenditure of time that adults in the household are making on a child or all children. I think from the perspective of children's development, you have to flip that around and say, who is this child here? Who is investing in that child? What is the sum total of time investments that that child is getting? When you do that, you get a very different portrait. Again, I'm going to focus on multi-generational households, which are illuminated in panel B, and children in married parent households who are represented in panel A. In very small font at the bottom, you can see the total number of minutes of daily caregiving that those two children get. I'm going to tell you that statistically, those two numbers do not differ. I'm also going to tell you that children in multi-generational households receive the exact same share of caregiving minutes from their grandparent as do children in married parent households receive from their biological fathers. This may be one reason why those children appear, at least in our study, to have equally positive outcomes. So again, this is a different way of looking at the data, but I think if you're going to talk about children's development, you have to take a child's perspective. Because of course, single mothers, as Melissa pointed out in her book, are doing lots of things. They're parenting, and they're working, and they're doing everything else. But we have to remember that there may be equally good substitutes for what that mother is unable to do. Thank you. Okay, I will finish. Okay, so very briefly, I do not think it's implausible to imagine that public policy can incentivize or support grandparents in their caregiving activities. And this is my final slide, which, with all due respect to Schoolhouse Rock, just lets you know that, again, I think that many of the same things many of the same words, the same phrases, the same concepts we've been using to argue for why we should be thinking about marriage as a solution to the developmental challenges children in single-parent households face, we might want to think about multi-generational households and what they can provide too. Thank you.
There we go. So thank you, Melissa, for that comprehensive summary of the data on trends in family structure, child outcomes, and to our panelists for their very thoughtful and incisive comments. You guys made the mistake of appointing a sociologist as moderator, so I'm gonna take some liberties here and inject some sociology into the discussion. And I wanted to revisit a point that Damon made, very quickly that I think I'd just be interested to hear more of all your reactions about. But that has to do with the intersection between norms about family structure and gender norms, gender roles, gender role expectations. There's a now classic book by the sociologist Arlie Hochschild called The Second Shift, right, which is about the revolution and gender norms that you described in your slides. And she documents about how norms around the role of women in work changed a great deal, such that they became expected to work for pay, often full-time, but also while shouldering a disproportionate amount of childcare and household labor. And she documents how this generates a great deal of stress on relationships, on mothers in particular. So in light of this, my question sort of comes in two parts. First, how should we think about considering shifting norms around family structure without also considering current gender norms? And then second, when considering the possibility of strengthening the norm of marriage or two-parent households, how should we weigh concerns about the well-being of parents, mothers in particular, against the potential benefits to children?
I'll go first. Okay, so I mean, this brings together a lot of the themes that came up. Let's start with gender roles, because one of the reactions that I've gotten, negative reactions to my book, is, hey lady, have you figured out how to break the patriarchy? Because if not, marriage isn't coming back. So let me just point out, I'm here because I have the privilege of a co-parent at home who's driving the girls to their soccer practices. So fundamentally, I don't think it's the case that women's economic progress is fundamentally at odds with the institution of two parents in a household. And I keep coming back to the fact that, the most economically successful group of women in our society, the college educated, are still the ones who are doing this task of raising kids primarily with someone else in the household. And so it's a potential question, not one that I ask in the book, but I think is worth asking, which is it the case that college-educated men, or at least the men who are partnering with college-educated women, are more accepting of shared household and child-rearing responsibilities, and that's part of the reason why marriage is still a more stable institution among that group? We can ask that question. Clearly, norms around who shares household and child-bearing responsibilities affects the formation and sustenance of healthy, egalitarian relationships. I think this also relates to Stephen's point about you want to be laissez-faire about norms. I agree that norms restrict people's freedom. Do you not think we should foster a norm where dads have to share the responsibilities for kids? Because that's part of this. Like, if part of the reason why marriage isn't working or two-parent households aren't forming as much as, by the way, people, and you referred to this, say they want outside the college-educated classes because a rigidness of traditional gender norms. I don't know that that's true, but I think that's worth asking. Is there a difference in gender norms between college-educated groups and everyone else that's contributing to this gap? Then the question about how we compare parents' well-being and kids' well-being, I mean, this is honestly part of why I think this is a conversation worth having. Again, everything we do in this country is about adult or elderly well-being. We do very little for kids' well-being. And I think this is one of the areas where maybe an emphasis on individual freedom has actually resulted in a situation where kids are not getting the input and commitment from two parents that I would say kids deserve. And so to the extent there's a tension between kids' well-being and what feels like welfare-enhancing freedom for adults at any given time, I will push on a norm that prioritizes children there.
I'm not saying you don't like kids.
Other reactions?
Sure. So let me start by saying that had I had time, I was going to articulate some norms that I was more comfortable with. One of them would be a norm simply saying that children deserve more priority in our society.
Yeah.
Another one was, and the reason I say that is that my view on norms, obviously I revealed part of it, which is they're essentially moral claims. And so if you ask me what norms we want society to cultivate, number one, equal treatment and equal respect for people. These are banal because they're so abstract. So one of them is about equality. Another one would be about solidarity. In other words, that we internalize other people in our decision making. And so if you start from that as the norms I think are clearly morally defensible, and the extent to which society cultivates them, I think that's great. I want to distinguish that from norms that focus on particular behaviors. And the reason for that is as I said, I think that there's very strong reasons to believe that overall parents are deeply committed to their children, and that individuals are deeply desirous of committed relationships. And so that therefore would require the specific statement about two parents to me was somehow that the trade-offs that people are making are not ones that I think as an impartial observer are appropriate, and that's too far from me. So I would rather say that cultivate the general issue of altruism. I mean, after all, I could say, look at South Korea. It spends 1.2% of GDP on private tutoring. That's a norm of orientation towards children. Now, you might ask whether or not there's a side effect to that in terms of the fertility rates, but let me leave that aside. The point is that if you said that societies are cultivating that type of altruism, that seems to be an admirable thing to do. If I say to you that we keep having to focus on this notion of equal respect, that has manifestations for the issues you brought up. The males doing the housework, et cetera, treating their wives as equals as opposed to some more complicated thing which I won't name in public. And so that's the sense in which I would like to articulate the norms in terms of general, as I said, moral commitments to treat each other equally and to internalize them. Where I was uncomfortable was having to do with the fact that we do worry about, obviously, the gender inequities in society. And so it's hard for me to focus on a behavior, a particular type of behavior, as opposed to the more Kantian general principles.
I would just add, I think that's a good point that Jeff brought up about what's the welfare of the parents versus the children. And I think that the thing that I would push back that comes up in the book is this framing of the marriage as a production of child raising. And I think, that's a little too limited in terms of thinking about why people get married. In addition to that, there's the well-being of the two parents. Is this a good idea for the two parents? And I think also that the well-being of the parents spills over to the children. So in my household, my parents were married when I was born. They became they were still cohabitating, and they had a very, their marriage had fizzled. And actually, once they actually moved out of the household, things, I didn't collect data on myself, but my subjective view was that things had improved, actually. I was less exposed to, attention in the household. I actually had improved, interactions with my father after he moved out because there was a less of some of the other problems present. So I think for some families, you have to take that into account. The other thing about the increase in resources, I think, even as economists, we want to think about two parents marrying together. That increases the resource, but there are also costs involved with two people living together, two parents. Three parents could increase the resources even more, but you could imagine that's costly too, to have a throuple in the household. But, more seriously, when you add someone else, when you want to stay married, there's increased resources and potentially increased costs for some families.
So if I might just continue briefly on the topic of norms, sociologists also make this distinction between injunctive versus descriptive norms. Injunctive norms are like what ought to be, or what people collectively perceive as being approved or disapproved of. And then descriptive norms are what people collectively perceive what actually is, or like how people act in a situation. And so, you know, I wonder when you talk about strengthening norms or changing norms, I mean, clearly the descriptive norm around marriage has changed, but, you know, I wonder if the injunctive norm has really changed much at all. And, you know, there's quite a lot of qualitative evidence. If you ask, you know, low-income, single parent families, do you want to get married? Yes, they revere the institution. They treat it as an ideal, but they just have a hard time envisioning how to realize that sort of prescriptive ideal given the constraints that they face. So in that setting, you know, I wonder what the consequences would be of sort of further strengthening, you know, injunctive norms around marriage. It seems like one potential side effect would be it just stigmatizes the people that, you know, aren't able to live up to it, or sort of makes, you know, the ideal seem even further out of reach. So, I mean, how do you think about shifting norms, strengthening norms, sort of given that distinction, and that it maybe injunctive norms around marriage haven't actually changed all that much?
Yeah, so I think this survey and qualitative evidence that a lot of these low-income, primarily unmarried couples, they want what highly educated parents have, which is stable, healthy relationships. And they have a lot of barriers to achieving that. And when you read the survey and qualitative evidence, what you hear from a lot of these people is they weren't raised in married parent homes. They're not surrounded by married people. That's not something very familiar to them. And so even if they say they want this, there are a lot of real barriers. There's mental health challenges, there's instability, there's incarceration, whether intermittent incarceration, there's intimate partner violence. And here's where I think it matters that as thought leaders or policymakers, we don't want to come across as prescribing norms, and so instead we keep leaning into government and schools to solve a lot of these problems, as opposed to saying, we understand that two-parent households are advantageous, and in the same way that we think college is advantageous, and we work to set a norm of college going, and we work to try and promote programs that help more people go to college, we are going to throw a lot of public, community, philanthropic research energy towards helping low-income couples achieve safe, stable, healthy relationships. But we don't do it because it's not a policy priority. It's not something we want to name. And that's where I think this matters. It's not about, I think there's a well-meaning intention. We don't want to stigmatize single parents, but what does that practically mean? That practically means there's no federal agency funding research into strengthening marriages or families. There's no, there's 1% of the Administration and Children and Families budget goes toward programs aimed at strengthening families, 1%. It's not a priority because we don't want to sound like we are, as a society, policymakers, social scientists, prioritizing one family or the other. And then the truth is, as you said, but a lot of these couples want that. And they have real barriers. And so my point is, I'm not trying to get anyone to do something that's like against their interests or going and telling people this is a bad relationship, but you should stay together for the sake of the kids. I think back to the language of welfare reform is astounding in how explicit it says, marital childbearing is a policy goal. We would never write national legislation that says that now. In 2008, President Obama gave a speech on Father's Day lamenting the millions of dads that were missing from houses. I don't think a Democratic president would give that speech today. And so all of this trickles down, I think, into a policy agenda that doesn't sufficiently help vulnerable families achieve the family structure that they themselves indicate often wanting to achieve.
Yeah.
So, in your book, you describe, but you haven't said it yet, just in your comment right now, that There have been large-scale randomized control trials of exactly this sort of thing I think you're describing, strengthening families, promoting marriage, trying to encourage better couple communication, especially among the low-income population who, as Melissa says, and as these data and studies by Kathy Eden show, would like to be married as their ideal. But I guess as a share of federal spending, as you say, that's a very small amount, but we always say, oh, I wish we had a randomized controlled trial. I mean, we actually have a lot of large-scale randomized controlled trials on exactly this question, and my reading of those data is that they have been very unsuccessful. So I just wonder what you might say to that. I guess I'm not quite as certain that we had this press in welfare reform and Obama, but that's completely disappeared.
Yeah,
I think there's probably a lot of people, a lot of politicians who would still agree with that.
What is there? There's like $65 million a year in grants towards responsible fatherhood and strengthening families programs compared to $10 billion on Head Start, which I think is wildly underfunded, by the way. But, the government evaluated some marriage promotion programs. They didn't work. To the government's credit and community groups' credit, those have shifted. They're not marriage promotion programs anymore. They're responsible fatherhood programs. They're strengthening families programs. They operate on shoestring budgets. And they have, as Ariel said, I would agree with this read, there's like gems of promise when you read them, because what do you see? You see dads want to be engaged. You see maybe there's a reduction in maternal stress, but there's no real increase in relationship stability or childhood engagement. Why? Well, it looks like because these men have real barriers. They're not employed, they have other barriers. So what do? Well, we keep saying those programs don't work. Let's keep innovating on schools and early childhood and childcare, as opposed to saying, let's try more comprehensive programs to help families. Let's double down on helping families. I mean, how many education interventions have been run with very weak results? How many training programs have been run with very weak results? We still invest in those things. And so this seems to be the one area of policy intervention where we got some weak RCTs and then sort of gave up and retreat to, let's go back to schools and the safety net and see what government can do.
So to follow up, I would say, with reference to what Jeff said, I agree that the injunctive norms, my judgment overall in our society are appropriate. And that's why I emphasize that to change norms is to say something about trade-offs. And I don't have a sense about the trade-offs. And that's where we have where there was a disagreement. On the other hand, here's a place where I think we do have agreement. I could have a norm of saying that people should be better parents. In other words, they should be more vested in their children. That's not a statement about family structure, per se. It's a statement about what I call altruism. That's the solidarity buzzword that I use, which I think matters. And so the extent to which one wants to make an argument that collectively as a society, that norm should be improved, I'm very sympathetic to that. That also leads, by the way, to broader conceptions of obligations. And so Ariel brought up this whole issue of grandparents. And so I will tell an anecdote. My wife was born in the Soviet Union and lived there and in Russia and came here 10 years ago to follow her daughter, who had moved many years ago because she's going to have her first child. And so when I met my wife, she was telling me her obligations as a grandparent. She was going to be in charge of teaching the Russian language, in charge of the music training, in charge of the gymnastics. And I was dumbfounded because I never would have conceived of these as obligations of grandparents. And so the serious point, of course, is that seems to me that's a norm that actually should be strengthened. And so if we think of this as a collective obligation, as a broad kinship obligation, it gets away from the idea that if somebody did something, that there's going to be an associated social sanction. And I think that it is inevitable in norms, there are components of sanctions there. They may come in the form of guilt, it may come in the form of shame, it may come in the form of stigma. But that's why, for me, the word norm evokes certain costs, and my preference is in making these normative arguments to focus on general ethical principles that emphasize the solidarity we all have in terms of improving the outcomes of children.
Can I just add one thing on the grandparent point? Ariel had me doing this hypothetical. I was like, would I swap out my husband for my mom and would my kids be better off? I mean, grandmas are awesome. I'm all for them. I actually was surprised in the data that 67% of single moms don't have an adult in their house. So I think something like 20% of them do have a grandma living in the house. I actually expected to see single moms leaning into grandparents more. But the other interesting thing I think this raises is you do have a lot of grandmas now making up for the absence of dads. And I think that raises interesting questions about elderly well-being and women's well-being. Because now we have generations of women who are raising kids without a dad in their house, and then they're doing it as grandmas too. So if we think about the well-being of women, is that really beneficial for women to now basically be raising teenagers into their 70s because they might have done this without a husband and now their daughters are doing it without a husband? And also, I mean, how comfortable are we with men really just being on the sidelines of family life in America, largely in response to some of their economic struggles and malaise? And so I'm not sure it's as, I don't know, ultimately welfare enhancing as we might initially think.
But just to be super clear, the question isn't whether you would swap out your husband for your mom.
I was kidding.
Yeah, but I think that's, yeah, but I mean, this is an important point. I think you raise a really important question. I mean, we talk about the welfare of the parents and how is this, this joint parenting arrangement being shared by the parents and their own parents? And is the grandparent getting anything out of that? Is that a site where they can also be supported? Are there economic benefits to those households living together? I think those are all exactly the right questions, and I don't know any research, that I can cite tonight that can help answer them.
So I've got lots more questions, but we do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. I think there's a mic going around, or no? No? Yep. There we go. I saw the hand in front first.
So it's been about 25 years since I worked in this area, but at that time, Sarah McClanahan and Irv Garfinkel were in the middle of this fragile family study. And the way they would have discussed the possibility of maybe a good norm that was lost was that the silver lining in having a norm of shotgun marriage was that it was understood that if you were a man and you created a child, you were supposed to contribute to the welfare of the child. And not put the burden of providing resources on the child on other people. And so they were very interested in what could be done. At that time, I think there were programs in Scandinavia where if you established paternity, it was kind of automatic. The government stepped in and collected support for the child. And they were very interested in strengthening child support laws and saying even if the couple couldn't get along and didn't want, at least there was this supporting the norm that the dad should contribute to the well-being of their children. It was a robust version of Steve's "we should all be good parents." And my memory was they found out that in the world we live in, it was very tough to design that policy to get what you wanted, because trying to enforce these orders on people who were struggling economically created a lot of stress within the relationship and sometimes backfired. And so I wanted to know if anyone had any thoughts about, A, do we agree having a norm that says if men create children, they should contribute to the child's welfare, that we could agree on that norm? But then if we agree on that norm, what do we do about it? Because I think it's very hard when a lot of people are judgment-proof and struggling economically. It's hard to build policy around that norm even if we agree on it. Sorry I took so long.
I'll respond quickly. So two things I conspicuously don't suggest changes to in the book because I think it's really complicated are child support enforcement and what you brought up about divorce laws. So when you look at the studies of these, things that might seem obvious wind up having unintended effects. And increasing child support enforcement, like actually there's some studies that show that that leads to less engagement of the kid with the dad because it becomes a bargaining tool and a point of contention. I was literally at a webinar this morning on responsible fatherhood programs. Burdensome child support enforcement is a real drain on a lot of low-income dads who are trying to reestablish economic stability and have their money taxed away. And so while at first blush it might seem obvious, well, clearly we need to increase child support enforcement, when you take a more holistic view, granting a norm that we want dads involved in their kids' lives, increasing child support enforcement isn't an obvious way, in my reading of the evidence, to do that. I don't know if anyone disagrees with that read.
I think we have time for maybe one more question from the audience.
I low-key had to. But my first was just a clarifying question for Melissa. When you're talking about among the married women who among the college-educated women who do have marriages, are we assuming that, or are you assuming that the college-educated women who are married actually maintain successful careers?
No, this is a really important question. So I actually do nothing to distinguish between like how different couples make it work, okay, right? Like whether you have two parents working or only one parent working or full-time or part-time. And I'm deliberate about that because, you know, the way I think about this is if you have two parents in the household, you have more choices, right? And so at any given time, you can optimize as a couple whether one of you is going to stay home full-time or part-time or through the kid's childhood, whereas we know that if there's only one parent in the household responsible for everything, they're more likely to have limited choices about whether they can pull back on work. So I do not distinguish between those things.
And then I guess a quick follow-up then is, for two-parent households, what are behaviors that are present that supposedly create a child's success or contribute to a child's success?
Yeah,
this
is a big one. I mean, and again, here I'm drawing on some of Ariel and her colleagues' work. I mean, the three buckets that I put them in, but there's more income coming into the household, there's more time spent with the children, and then there's more emotional bandwidth or lower levels of stress. All of that allows parents to sort of parent the way they want to in ways that are beneficial to the kids. That's right.
Well, one thing I just wanted to add about, there's a chapter on what parents do, the investments that parents make into children. And just one other thing that was interesting about that is there was this reference to the quote unquote rugrat race of the things parents do for kids is grown exponentially in terms of driving kids to this and that. And I think that links to what Stephen was talking about in terms of memberships. One question I think is interesting for research for us to think about is, are these exclusive memberships, do they have negative spillovers on the other kids? Mm-hmm. So when you are investing in building a castle around your kid and their opportunities, are some of these things a little more zero sum? For some of these lottery tickets, like the fanciest schools or the most selective schools or selective opportunities, do these things, does the individual investment in your children versus children in general, are there some trade-offs there? I thought that was interesting to think about.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for a very productive discussion, and to you all for coming out to our inaugural book talk series at the Stone Center. There's a little reception after this, so hang around. Feel free to come ask questions, and thank you again.
Thanks.